Hello, I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director of 1455. I'm really happy to be here today to kick off our second annual Summer Literary Festival with the recipient of our Storytelling Award, Jean Case. A little bit about me, for those of you that don't know. Before I started 1455, I was a writer. I continue to be a writer. I talk to writers. I write about writing, and I'm very involved in the kind of the artistic side of things. But for 2 decades before this venture, I was in the corporate world, all of which is to say that the combination of my artistic inclinations, but experience and interests and the things I've seen made me the ideal demographic for Jean Case's book, Be Fearless. And I'm here to tell you that the experience of reading this in the fall did not disappoint, so much so that I immediately made my executive board read it. And then that enthusiasm carried over, and a lot of our advisory board read it. And as we started to talk about our first storytelling award, there was a unanimous consent that this book, being timely and relevant, was an obvious choice. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Jean Case, and let me give you her brief bio. She's the chairman of the National Geographic Society, the CEO of Case Impact Network and Case Foundation. She's a businesswoman, investor, philanthropist, internet pioneer who's a passionate believer in the power of business to do good and advocates for the importance of embracing a more fearless approach to innovate and bring about transformational breakthroughs. Jean, congratulations on adding best-selling author to your already long and impressive resume. I'll just kick off my questioning by saying what I really enjoyed most about the book is I learned so much. There was obviously considerable research and time put into this, but you were really able to seamlessly weave a lot of your personal narrative into this, which gave it a very personal feel, but also kind of proved the courage of your convictions and showed that you've had a lot of skin in this game. So the first thing that struck me was that, and I think you do us all a very great service by debunking this notion that big success is a result of unique genius or connections or your alma mater. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you made that discovery and how it applies to your 5 principles. And also, thank you and welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Sean. I've really been looking forward to being with you for this event. I really want to give you and the entire team at 1455 kudos for what you're doing. I think it's really important work, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. So thank you so much. So the book really probably started to be born many years before I started officially writing it. It was at the 15th anniversary of the Case Foundation that we started asking some pretty deep questions about our work as we look back over time. And, you know, the sort of saying around the Case Foundation is we invest in people and ideas that can change the world. And so we had this moment where we said, well, why is it we've seen great things no matter where we go in the world, small villages, big cities, across the nation, rural, it doesn't matter. People have great ideas, but sometimes they take them forward to great success and sometimes they don't. So we didn't really understand after all these years of working in the field and being on the front lines what that looked like. So we hired some social scientists to go to school on that very question. And really, it's exactly what you just said, Sean. What the headline was out of the research was very much that it's ordinary people who end up doing extraordinary things. And how they get there is not the way we think. Just as you said, so many people think they have to have money or connections or wealth or power or have gone to the right school or be from the right place. But indeed, what we discovered was it was a simple application of the 5 principles I draw out in the book. Now, I'm well aware that this is a storytelling award, and I must tell you that, we'd been teaching the principles for many, many years before I sat down to write the book. And it was very clear that the principles, the data science is what it is, right? But it was when we would go into the storytelling that the application and the understanding of those principles suddenly became clear.
Well, one of the things you said, and I'm not sure, you can correct me if it's actually in the book or from one of the talks that I've seen you give, you have a wonderful takeaway quote that says something along the lines of, data is not ultimately what changes heart and minds, stories do. And I think that cuts across, obviously the business world, the artistic fields, and everything in between. But talk a little bit more about how you really came to see from seeing, high level executives to smaller, scrappy startups that, this data is good, but you have to tell the story about it.
Yeah, well, I must tell you, I've been also highly influenced by my role as chairman of National Geographic. National Geographic's mission includes storytelling, right? We are a science-based organization, but I've seen time and time again, literally every single day, examples where the science is clear, but until you can put it in a storytelling mode, sometimes it doesn't break through to people to influence their hearts and their minds around things like care of our planet, et cetera. So I think I've been really benefited while I kind of was taking forward this work of Be Fearless, also sitting in this chair at National Geographic and seeing every day the power of storytelling. But we didn't really truly capture the stories as we were out teaching Be Fearless for a number of years before I wrote the book. The book really was a wonderful opportunity. And of course, I tell the story in the book of, I was born in a very small town in Illinois called Normal, Illinois. Remember, ordinary people. And I actually don't think anyone's ordinary, but when you think about sort of small town or whatever, Normal is definitely iconic of that. And so I went back to Normal to write the book. And I basically got an Airbnb around the corner from where my grandparents lived. And I spent so much time in their home and wrote the book. 80% of it was written during that period of time. But where I wanted to go with that is to say, I was living the stories of these people as I was researching. I mean, and I know you're a prolific writer, and so many of the people at 1455 are very talented writers. And so you know what I mean. I literally felt like I checked into a different universe while I wrote these stories. And it was truly a wonderful experience to wake up every day and be so inspired by all of these stories that I really tried to highlight in the book.
Well, like I said, it's so clearly a labor of love. It's so clearly something that was, and I knew this, from before the book came out, the work you were doing. So clearly the work, and that's a good lesson for any writer, right? Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, the lived experience, the story has to mean something meaningful to the author if they have any hope of conveying that enthusiasm to a reader. But I had mentioned how, and I think it's a good way to set up, how you really dove deep into some of these other stories. You talk about your own story. And the thing that I didn't know, and I don't think anyone would know without reading this book, is that you yourself, at a point in your career where you were already successful and had a certain amount of very traditional stability, had to make an excruciating decision that you had people close to you naysaying. Tell us a little bit about your first kind of move from the traditional world, the analog world, frankly, to what ended up being a transformational experience.
Yeah, well, I think there were two transformational moments, and they really represent, one of the principles is people take risks. And, I think for me, they were among my greatest risk-taking moments, if you will. Yes, I was brought to Washington to work for President Reagan, and I was a political science major in college and literally left college to come take that job here in Washington. And everything was going well, and then there was a budget hiccup. And so they came in one day and said, I had this big office. I had a really kind of fancy title for a young person. I think I was 21. And they said, well, there's a little bit of a hiccup. There's going to be like a 3-month gap, maybe a 4-month gap before your position can be, we can get it back in the budget again. And can you just go chill? I'm like, go chill. I have rent and a car payment. No, I can't go chill for 3 or 4 months. Thank you very much. And so basically I realized I had to go out, even though they intended to call me back, which they ultimately did try. But during that time, look, I had to make rent. And so my back was against the wall, which is a story of a lot of people when they're at that high risk taking moment, they've sort of got nothing to lose. And I heard about this job at this new technology company. I did not understand what it was they did when I first started talking to them, but it turned out to be, of course, the first online service. We would call it an internet service today, and it was called The Source. And I never looked back. I realized that the potential to work in what would become the internet was such a greater opportunity to empower people than I would have had in that political science job working in a presidential administration. And then later, of course, GE recruited me, and that's where I really felt like, I think I was 25 and I was on the management track. You know, when you are at GE, there's a lot of good signaling and training. Then I get a call from this little place no one had ever heard of down the road, and it was a startup trying to take on, you know, the entrenched, which it wasn't a big market at that time, but the established players, and asked me if I would come as I'm chief marketing officer. And I said yes. And everyone around me, Sean, thought I was insane, because that security you talked about, GE at the time was, you know, the most successful company in the world, and everyone wanted to work for GE. But I never looked back. But I'm not going to lie to you to say it wasn't like there was some degree of concern as I made that decision. But it had to tune out everyone telling me to stay with the comfortable route, because I really believe what would become AOL, of course, had the potential to change the world, and ultimately it did.
You took a big bet, and suffice it to say it paid off. So Jean, one of the reasons I was so excited and just certain about this award, and why I've recommended this book to so many people, is it isn't just all these things we're talking about as a series of business cases and inspirational stories, but I really think, again, for me, what resonated and what I'm so enthusiastic about is this sense of encouragement and reminding people that very seldom does anything have that eureka moment, right, with a lightning bolt and the path is clear and there's security. There has to be some semblance of getting out of a comfort zone. And I think, again, I think you wonderfully thread that needle between encouraging risk, but also, you know, you're not telling people to jump off cliffs. The magic doesn't just happen, but maybe tease out a little bit. Some of this does involve getting out of a comfort zone, and you're not going to be able to have transformational breakthroughs if you stay in this comfort zone.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the principles, which happens to be my favorite, is let urgency conquer fear. And I think, you know, I sometimes like to start talks about Be Fearless by making it clear that being fearless is not the absence of fear, because we all have fear. In fact, it's a little unnatural if you don't have fear at some points. It's given to us for a reason. But it's the ability to look that fear in the eye and push past it. And I think that's what we see, you know, in many cases. But, you know, today, if we think about it, we're living in a moment where, you know, there's some churning going on inside. No matter where you are on the spectrum of things, chances are you're looking at the world. Even before COVID, this was true. Now add COVID, now add what we've been through with, you know, race and social justice being, you know, headlined every day, and realities of what people are living through being made clearer than ever before. So some of us are feeling a churning inside, and I like to say, whenever you're feeling that, you know, whether it's anger, frustration, listen to that, because time and time again, as I draw out in the book, those are the moments when people could dig deep to get out of their comfort zone, make a bet, and try something new that could be transformative. And, you know, I wish we could all just live in the comfort zone, because it's a mighty fine place to spend time, but it turns out nothing great comes from the comfort zone. If you really want to be transformational in your efforts, no matter what they are, you've got to get a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, and dare I say or suggest that disruption and this sense of not having a safety net, if those that are going to achieve bigger things see the opportunity in those moments that might not otherwise exist. So sometimes circumstances push you out of your comfort zone, and that's when I think the real leaders step up. As a very modest example, I can talk about this literary festival being virtual. Certainly in February, that wasn't the plan. And I've talked to a few reporters that it's a fair question, but a few of them have said, you know, did you think about just canceling it? And I have to say, maybe 10 years ago or you know, 20 years ago in my life, I would have said, yeah, it doesn't make sense. But I just immediately leaned into, well, why is this happening, and how can we make it work? The answer might have been, it's just not going to work. But as it turns out, by embracing this technology, which has certainly been probably the dominant theme of democratizing content in the 21st century, we're now able to reach even more people. So it doesn't minimize the very real issues in the world, but this festival being virtual is proof that in these times of extraordinary circumstances, there are some potential opportunities.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I give you great credit for going forward with it. And chances are, because we're living through this in National Geographic as well, chances are you'll emerge from it with new ways, right, that become your new standard or your new normal, that do have the potential to reach more people in more places with what you're doing. In the earliest of months, a friend of ours had a book come out, and it was called Redefining Success. His name is Doug Holliday. It's a great book. I want to recommend it to your audience. But I did a book party for him because we were going to do a physical book party. Now, when we've done book parties for people, and your authors know this, it's usually 100 people, maybe it's 50 people, right? And then you just do a series of them. Well, we had like 500 people at that virtual book party. And it was, to me, such a great example of how many more people could be reached with the message than if we had done the classic thing we would always do when we can all get together physically.
Right. And my takeaway from this is, right, we have to adapt. And I think, going forward, it will probably for the foreseeable future be in some kind of hybrid. We want to return to so-called normalcy, but just like, AOL proved, and a lot of these breakthroughs that you detail in the book, things change, and a lot of people aren't comfortable with that, but those that see the future are kind of leaning into it. But the other thing I really wanted to talk about today, you talk about fear and what that means really, but you also talk about failure. And I think that from where I stand, if writers know one thing, they know failure, because the default mode is rejection. So I want to go on the record as saying, not only do I love this book and I appreciate what you did, I will recommend this book to writers more than my friends in the business world, because frankly, a lot of books about writing talk about what you debunk. If you're a genius and you have this passion, the reality is perseverance. It's shrugging off failure and learning from rejection. But you talk about that, and maybe you can talk about one or two of your favorite, either personal or stories where you saw someone that failed or was rejected, and just by a combination of perseverance, but also leaning into that fear, better things happened.
Well, and there's a close relationship between fear and failure. And I think really what I tried to draw out through the stories in the chapter about Make Failure Matter is really just to highlight that anyone who's gotten to the other side has gone through a series of failures to get there. And of course, in the literary world, could there be a more iconic story than J.K. Rowling, which I also talk about, right? Manuscript rejected 12 times, etc. And she has a brilliant speech, if you haven't seen it, that she gave at Harvard on the subject of failure. And it just, takes my chapter and goes way beyond that. But I just, I think it's such an important principle. And I said before, my favorite is Let Urgency Conquer Fear. I can't say Make Failure Matter is my favorite, but it's probably the most important one. And, I think that one of my favorite stories that I told was of Milton Hershey, and the reason I think his story is so important, so we know the Hershey Chocolate Company today, but a lot of people don't know the story behind it. And his father left when he was young, and he had to go out and work. And eventually he became like an apprentice to a candy maker. And then he decided he would strike out on his own. And so his mom and his aunt loaned him some money, and he started a candy company. And then that failed. And then he went out to Denver where his dad was living. He started one there. That failed. This cycle went a few times. I think it was probably company number 5 before he started Hershey. And, what I was most moved by in reading some of the diaries and things like that was, his mom and his aunt stayed by his side, loaning him $100. And a family reunion was taking place before he had started Hershey. And they said, we don't want him to come. He's a drifter and a loser. And, you think about how would you judge someone who's on attempt number 4 or 5 and hasn't found success yet? I thought about it as a parent. Like, if that was my child continuing, at some point would I say, you might want to think about something else. But thankfully they believed in him. He found great success with the Hershey Company. He took all of his stock and gave it to a school he started for kids who didn't have support that they needed. Today, that school has a $12 billion endowment and provides great education to kids who otherwise might not have access to a great education. He really created a model community in Hershey, Pennsylvania. The reason we know Hershey Park is a fun place is because he really started that as a way. He was asking people to come out of the city and work for him in Hershey, and he knew he needed to provide some community benefits for the families. So, you know, a lot of things that are being talked about, and what I'm spending a lot of time on, is stakeholder capitalism. But when you look back at Milton Hershey's story, he cared deeply for all of his stakeholders to build that great company that endures even to this day. But really, it's a story of failure, overcoming it.
Right, right. Well, and there's so many inspiring moments like that, even amongst the titans. You know, again, this has probably never been far from my mind, but in your talks and in the book, you talk about Steve Jobs. The iconic Steve Jobs was fired from the company that he created. So, I mean, across the board, failure is interwoven.
And Oprah fired from TV and told she's not right for television, right? When I teach MBA classes, you know, I named one of the chapters after what I do in my class. It's called Fail in the Footsteps of Giants, because it's exactly that, Sean. It's time and time again. And you know, the problem with that too often is, and I will say this to all of your writers out there, as you find success, it's easy to sanitize or not talk about the failures because they are embarrassing or they don't feel good. And so when I teach a class at a university, I start with my failure resume, where I make it really clear the failures. If we were more honest and more transparent about the bumps in the road, the failures, the shortcomings, I think it would really inspire young people differently to say, okay, it's not over curtains when I run into my first failure because I know this person got over theirs. But too often we do sanitize stories a little bit.
I would even say we fetishize success, and that's an understandable. I think in America, there's a tendency to lionize, and the books are usually written by, you know, a ghostwriter talking about the achievements. Again, I think a tremendous service in this book, especially or particularly for writers or those in any artistic field, is this idea that very seldom does someone become an overnight success, or an overnight success is still usually the result of years and hours of hard work. The other thing that I thought was really refreshing, and I want to celebrate you for this too, despite the obvious successes, you really make it a point to talk about leadership that listens and welcomes the perspectives of others. I could see a cynic saying, yeah, that's really 21st century, but you really talk about the power of inclusivity and hearing these voices. Maybe talk a little bit about, you know, what you've seen and how that also crosses big companies and small startups.
Yeah, well, obviously, you know, we've been working on diversity and inclusion like as long as I can remember. But, you know, there's a story that's interesting. I did not know it when I wrote the original manuscript. And by the time the paperback came out, I had learned it. And so I included it in the paperback version. But it's a story of a guy named Richard Montanez, who works for Frito-Lay. And Richard, early in his career, he was raised in Mexico and then came to the United States, had an opportunity to get a job at a Frito-Lay factory, and he was a janitor there. But he would take Fritos home to his community, and he would put spices on them because his friends were used to spicy food, and they didn't really like just the plain old Fritos. So he basically came up with a recipe. Well, he was bold enough to write the CEO of PepsiCo, which owned Frito-Lay, and proposed to him that he should try some spicy chips. That the whole, you know, that these snack products had a real sort of untapped market in Latino and Hispanic people. And so on the next trip to California, the CEO decides to visit that plant and to meet Richard. And Richard has him taste these chips that he had built a recipe for. And the CEO says, put your broom away, you're coming with us. And that launched for Richard a new career at Frito-Lay / PepsiCo. And today he's the vice president there. He basically developed the idea of flamin' hot Cheetos. And it's a over $1 billion business. So, you know, it's a great example of a guy who didn't even feel good about his English skills, didn't have a traditional education, came from Mexico, was working, you know, in a job where you wouldn't really necessarily assume anyone's going to listen to you when you have an idea. And yet look at what that launched and what that's done. So it was, to me, a really, really powerful example of a leader listening, because how many CEOs would have read the letter? How many CEOs would have said, sure, I'll come meet with you? But Roger Enrico did, and Roger was a dear friend. He was a CEO. He passed a few years back. And I just think that's a really great image and picture of leadership, not just from a, you know, broadening your perspective, but even from a, you know, really smart business, you know, technique, if you will, is to make sure you're listening to different voices out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this short conversation, I think, underscores what my takeaway was, which is, again, for anyone that should read this book, you really, in addition to having a lot of inspirational stories, a lot of anecdotes that can be utilized, you debunk a lot of the typical and frankly cliched and maybe even false kind of bromides about what success entails and what it involves. And you talk about, you know, as we've mentioned, you not embracing the potential of failure, overcoming fear, using it as a motivating force, and listening and embracing diversity. You know, these are all self-evident, but the real strength of the book, in my opinion, is that you have all of these case studies that demonstrate time and time again that this is how it works.
Thank you, Sean. And on that subject, I would like to say just a couple things. You know, one of the people I highlight in the book is Melody Hobson. And Melody is just a killer leader in the world of finance. She's president of Ariel Investments in Chicago. And as a Black woman, Melody has really been called on, particularly in recent days, to bring a voice to these issues around race. And you know, anyone could Google her now and find her talking about not being colorblind, but being color brave. And I talk about her in the book, but I really think she is a great model of a voice out there that's trying to bring people along who are asking the hard questions about, how do I need to change? How does my organization need to change? What can we all do?
Mm-hmm. Well, Jean, it's been wonderful talking to you. I think I would be remiss to not ask the obligatory last question, which is there going to be another book? Where are you at in terms, are you taking some time to recover from this? Where's your head at? I think the world needs a follow-up. There's always more stories to tell.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories to tell. And of course, a lot of stories ended up on the cutting room floor. But Sean, I just hope to be as prolific as you have been some days. I do expect there will be another book. It's unclear if it will be a follow-up to Be Fearless, but we have plenty of stories to keep us going for some amount of time. But listen, I want to thank you so much in 1455. It's been a real delight to be with you. It's fun to share our old AOL affiliation. And I just wish you all the best with this conference, and thanks for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Jean. Thank you. And again, anyone that's still on the fence, are you crazy? Pick up Be Fearless, and trust me, it will radically realign your thinking, and good things will come of that. Jean, be well. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon at some point.
Great. Thanks so much. All the best.